From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and in this podcast, I speak with thought leaders and peace builders who share their reflections and best practices towards achieving objectives of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Africa. In this episode, I'm joined by Ilwad Elman, a social activist and Chief Operations Officer at the Elman Peace and Human Rights Center in Mogadishu. Ilwad Elman joins me from Mogadishu, and we have a conversation about the realities of peace building and how we can learn from this to adapt resolutions and frameworks for the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Ilwad Elman, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. Your parents, Elman Ali Ahmed and Fatun Adan, co-founded the Elman Peace and Human Rights Center in Mogadishu. And as the war intensified, your mother left with you and your sisters to Canada for safety, and your dad remained behind to continue to advocate for peace, but was unfortunately assassinated in 1996. And then you returned to Somalia from Canada in 2010. And you said in a recent interview, you said that everything that the media was reporting about Somalia then was the situation that you were confronted with when you arrived. So, Ilwad, tell us what prompted your return to Somalia from Canada. Describe to us those early years back in Somalia at a time when the violence was still raging and you just returned from the safety of Canada.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this important podcast and for having this conversation with me. And yes, when I did first return to Somalia, I really was confronted with everything that mainstream media depicted of Somalia, of a country in conflict, which is, a literal front line in my backyard. There was no mobility, there was no movement. There was military barracks everywhere, mortars every night, and it was everything that you had expected it to be. And it was terrifying coming from a context like Canada, but I was somewhat, I think, mentally prepared for that. Unfortunately, the narrative of Somalia hasn't changed much, despite the progress, and it's still depicted as such, as a country in an armed conflict. However, being in Somalia for as long as I have been now, since 2010, I have seen that even in context of armed conflict, that there is so much more than what is depicted in mainstream media, that there is life, that there is community and resilience, and there is support and love and efforts by everyday people every single day to just survive. And those are the things that are not covered in the media. So when I returned, I was confronted by the real realities of war and what that means for the everyday person, but also how they live in spite of that.
And it's interesting that you talk about media because we have, for example, Hodan Nelea, whom I had the pleasure to call a friend, who was like you, a Somali Canadian who returned to Somalia with a mission to change that narrative of Somalia, as you said earlier on. And for her, she was using media. And unfortunately, she was murdered in an attack by Al Shabaab in Mogadishu in July 2019, 2 weeks actually before we were due to meet in Nairobi, me and her. And you're certainly also not new to losing activists of peace in your line of work. Your father, like I said, was murdered in the 90s. And your older sister, Alma Elman, was also killed in November 2019, just a few months after Hoden. So you have had such great personal loss and sacrifices in your advocacy for peace and conflict resolution. Yet you still stand strong on the front line faced with extreme violence. Peace building can and is often also deeply traumatic for peace builders like yourself. And you shared your experiences in a very powerful article with The Hill. And a line that struck me from your article was, and I quote you, living in a conflict zone means that there is no post traumatic stress disorder, only cyclical traumatic stress events that one experiences and has to self manage in order to survive both physically and mentally every single day. So, Ilwad, what keeps you going? And do you think we do enough to acknowledge, support, and document the trauma that women peace builders like yourself go through?
Well, first of all, I can't answer that question without acknowledging all of the people that you mentioned that we have lost in pursuit of peace. Having a great friend of mine as well too, who was a beaming light of joy, not just in Canada but in Somalia as well too, who really did try to change the narrative of Somalia in mainstream media, and was unfortunately killed in Somalia. And she reached out to so many people, and myself included, and we never did manage to get an interview on the books. But her mission really was to show that there really is so much more than just what is depicted about countries in conflict, and for that to inform the global diaspora, to influence global policy, and even strategies that are used to build peace in contexts like Somalia. So I honor her in this message. My late father, whose footsteps I follow, and it's unfortunate that more than 25 years later, since he was assassinated, that his very simple and practical recipe for building peace by working at the local level, by working with community members, by working with those that are directly affected by our conflict, and amplifying localization in the process, are just now being processed as being discussed at the global level. But it's taking us this long to recognize that you cannot build or sustain peace without community at the heart of it. And my beloved sister also lost her life in Somalia, so it's incredibly traumatic. It's tragic, and I'll be honest with you by saying that was the first time I ever felt disillusioned by my mission in Somalia, when we lost her, thinking that maybe it is too soon to try to build peace in a context of conflict. Our idea is too radical. Her death was just a day after I had briefed the UN Security Council on the need for reconciliation. So it also demonstrates a big disconnect between the global discourse on reconciliation and bringing communities together through global policy and multilateralism, and then at the grassroots, really leaving your house every day with the idea that not is something going to happen, but when is it going to happen? So the trauma and the burden that frontline actors carry and the lack of support that they have has been a personal mission of mine, much informed by my own personal trauma as well too, and seeing a lot of my colleagues that work in the sector quitting, some of them, really suffering from mental health issues, and desperately reaching out to external actors for support, but not being able to get that because of either visa issues or lack of facilities or experts that are available to them. And it's astonishing to think that how can these peace builders and frontline actors be entrusted to implement programs, to be the pillars of strength in their community, to provide psychosocial counseling and support and trauma healing to their communities, when they themselves are sharing the same hardships as their community and are not able to replenish their cup. So dealing with trauma and remaining resolute and grounded in your convictions amidst constant challenges and setbacks is very difficult. And I am fortunate enough to have a community of friends around the world that help me grounded, that have allowed me to have access to different alternative mental health coping mechanisms and skills, and we're beginning to decentralize that and share that with other people in Somalia as well too. And it's an uphill battle, to be honest, because we are all in a constant state of survival. And in that survival mode, it's considered weak or ungrateful to even speak about the trauma that you should be so lucky to have survived. So to begin to now create a culture in which it is acceptable or normalized or even encouraged to unload and not be considered weak is some of the changes that we're trying to make. And women peace builders, they face a different type of challenge than men do, you know, further compounded by the systemic exclusionary practices because of their gender, because of the harassment they face in the field, because of the tokenism, and then also trying to overcome, I think, cultural and traditional barriers as well too that make the already difficult work even more challenging. So there's such a strong need for support groups and building a community of practice that not just builds technical skills in the field of peace and security, but social emotional skills as well too, and offers reprieve to women peace builders.
So we can see that you're clearly using your trauma and the processing of your trauma as part of your kind of developing peace building interventions. And I recall in the article that I mentioned earlier on, you said that you were decolonizing the wellness space for conflict related trauma and violence. How are you doing this, and what lessons can those people listening to this podcast learn in order to replicate it elsewhere? And also, how do we sustain it?
Well, when I say about decolonizing the wellness space, is that when you think of mental health and well-being, that shouldn't be a luxury. That's not a box to tick after war. It shouldn't be looked at as a fancy retreat that you go to or, you know, a vacation, but it should be looked at as a fundamental priority as part of building peace. And that's been a very big challenge when we speak to donors and they're willing to support hard security measures, preventing and countering violent extremism, putting women at the front lines of becoming insider mediators. Yet you talk about then also supplementing them with mental health support and access to resources to manage the trauma that they inherit as a result of this work, or to have an outlet to be able to talk about the harassment that they face or the threats that they face. It's considered as unnecessary. So it's really about looking at how do we look at practices like yoga, for example, that laud themselves as being for everybody in the physical sense and really for everybody in the inclusive sense. And the argument is always that wellness and mental health is a luxury, and we believe it can't be an optional second, because if you don't have peace within, how can you build peace externally?
Absolutely. And peace within is also very critical when it comes to things like sexual violence, for example. You co founded the first rape crisis center in Somalia for survivors of sexual and gender based violence called Sister Somalia. And you also chair and are a member of several other groups and committees that work to protect survivors, like the Child Protection Gender Based Violence Case Management Group, the Advisory Committee for Research in Gender Based Violence, Social Norms in Somalia and South Sudan, the Women Waging Peace Network for Inclusive Security, and so much more that we could possibly list here today. So you clearly know the issues, you have the extensive knowledge and experience of what is going on, what is working, and what is not. You've been shortlisted for the Nobel Peace Prize as well for your work. So, based on this wealth of experience, what would you consider the critical gaps to meaningfully, and I use that word very specific, meaningfully address conflict related gender based violence in the context of the women, peace, and security agenda? And more importantly, what solutions would you like to see happening locally and globally in addressing these?
You began this interview with reciting that, you know, we're coming up just over 20 years of the UN Resolution 1325, and every year we celebrate it. And it is indeed a historic document, but I think many peace building practitioners at the front lines, like myself, are quite tired of just patting ourselves on the back and celebrating documents that may not be fit for purpose anymore, or have established a frame of reference that we needed 20 years ago, but we haven't held ourselves accountable as to how many women have been enabled or empowered to be a part of the peace and security process as a result of the resolution. So what more has it done than being a historical frame of reference? And so when I reflect on the realities of today, we still see that there's a real need to act to prevent the blatant misuse of power in sexual exploitation and abuse that we are witnessing in Somalia and in many other countries. We see this happening consistently. The mechanisms for reporting human rights abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence, the mechanisms themselves are not gender sensitive. They're not confidential enough. They're not non-discriminatory enough. And there's still a fear of stigma of those survivors and activists supporting them to report, particularly when the perpetrators are those that have the duty of care of the community. To protect women from these human rights abuses and to really ensure accountability, we need more accountability for the atrocities that have been committed by all armed groups and security forces. We need to address sexual and gender-based violence as well as civilian casualties. And we need to reinforce and ensure that justice systems are established. Protection of civilians, protections of women and girls in context of armed conflicts, to me, is about ensuring that people can live without fear and building relationships that leverage the existing frameworks that we have, not just 1325 agenda, but also international humanitarian law, and looking at it from a gender responsive manner. These are all, we have all the systems in place. We have the declarations, the resolutions, the commitments, the voluntary pledges that have been made by the UN member states and even countries like mine that are still fragile and recovering. But what remains is, matching the resources to the rhetoric for inclusion and participation.
You spoke very eloquently there about the need to kind of repurpose certain resolutions for the realities today, and that notion that, UNSCR 1325, for example, is 20 years old is an important thing to consider in terms of how then do we make it relevant. So if you give me one concrete example of how you would like to see UNSCR 1325 adapted,
I think that there's many processes, like, for example, disarmament, rehabilitation, and reintegration, which is the sector that I work in. The preconditions for that entire process, which are reliant on an enabling environment, on the warring factions coming to a peace agreement, and then resolutions like 1325 that are meant to enable women to be a part of that process, to play with mediation and negotiation of that peace agreement. It's not fit for purpose because the preconditions of DDR in itself are not fit for context. Groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram are not coming to the negotiation table. But there is an opportunity to promote defection, demobilization at the front lines, and women like myself are doing that every day. Till now, there isn't a single peace agreement where a woman has been a signatory to. We talk about protection in Resolution 1325. But even when we look at protection of women peacebuilders, it's always looking at it from a sexual violence perspective and not looking at the other types of threats that women face, especially when it comes to reprisals of working with bodies like the UN, with security forces or government agencies. When we talk about transitional justice aims in post-conflict societies, the resolution needs to be more informative of local practices as well too, to help build communities of support and protection around women, and not think that international human rights law or international sanctioning is what's going to protect women in context of armed conflict. So finding ways to localize 1325 developing action plans that are rooted in the communities and influenced by their culture, their religion, their social norms, and adapting it in such a manner, I think is important. In Africa, we have various, declarations as well too that are specific to the role of women, peace and security. We have different accords as well. And there's a big disconnect between these frameworks that we have in place and what's happening. The community is not involved or at the table.
You were personally mentored by Kofi Annan alongside other youth leaders, and you were part of former US President Barack Obama's Young African Leaders Initiative. So you're a prime example of intergenerational dialogue and co leadership in peace that is currently being operationalized in many examples. So, and you've spoken very eloquently there about, again, gaps between the resolutions and the processes and the realities on ground and the potentials for missed opportunities. But I want to think now more in terms of that, your youth lens. Okay, so what are your reflections on with a youthful lens with which we can approach the women, peace, and security agenda, especially in relations to what you said around localizing, sexual and gender based violence, etc.?
Well, the time that I've had to be the extraordinary opportunity I had being mentored by Kofi Annan, it shaped my thinking about global policy, about peace building and leadership incredibly. And it's one that I follow to this day. And one of the things I think about that I learned from him is if it's not working, fix it. So from a youth perspective as well too, I think that, and Albert Einstein said this as well too, right? That the ultimate form of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So young people are not waiting to be included. They're not asking for permission. I was part of developing, championing, training, doing the consultations for the historic UN Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. So we're creating our own frameworks as well too. But even so, outside of just the international resolutions, which create an entry point for accountability, from a youth dynamic perspective, we're also looking at how do we develop a new frame of reference that's fit for context. And some of the work that I have been involved with is actually working with UN agencies and the Folk Bernadette Academy, FBA, which is a Swedish agency, on rewriting what DDR can look like in a context of violent extremism, where the preconditions don't exist, and leveraging the lived experiences of peace builders like myself and countries that have been in protracted conflicts. So, from a youth perspective, I think that there's a lot of fed upness. And in that fed upness, it's not just about agonizing, but organizing towards solutions, leading with what we are for, as opposed to constantly complaining about the things that we are against. Knowing that there is power and ability and empirical evidence of best practices amongst how young people organize and create change, and then upstreaming that to inform global policy as well too. So when we look at young people, I think there's been a significant shift of how they are viewed in the peace building space as well too, as not just implementing partners or beneficiaries at best, or allowed to engage in peer-to-peer or sports or advocacy initiatives, which are all very important part of the peace process, but that they also have a critical role to play in hard security, counterterrorism, negotiations, inside and mediation, and all of the spaces that before were considered not their domain. In this lies still the challenge, though, of what it means to be a young woman peace builder, where the women, peace, and security agenda still often leverages the networks and the contributions of iconic women peace leaders, but excludes young women, often through cultural barriers. We see this a lot in my country, in Somalia. And then the youth peace and security agenda, which is a bit more gender responsive and intersectional, yet youth in this space still means elite young men. And young women are still viewed primarily as the spoils of war, and their agency and their ability is often undermined and limited. And the challenges that they, or I should say we, face in this space is further compounded. And I think that women, children, people with disabilities all come together as one special interest group. And each have their own lived different experiences and realities when it comes to conflict. And so this is some of the stuff that we're looking at changing as well too. But I think that there is a resurgence amongst, I wouldn't say maybe not a resurgence, but a recognition that you can't leave youth behind. Every social movement in history has been championed by young people. And where they are not invited, they create their own tables. And it's in the interest of states, I think, and governments to leverage that, because where they are not maximizing on it and leveraging it, others are. Extremist groups like Al Shabaab, both in Mozambique, they have Al Shabaab. In Somalia, the same group called Al Shabaab literally translates to the youth in Arabic. If they can harness the potential and see the power and the numbers in youth, why can't others?
And part of that harnessing is also how do we connect and communicate with the youth. And I know that the Elman Peace Center has been using TikTok as a way to connect with younger people around peace building. How has that been going for you?
It's good. We've just recently started using TikTok, but grown very fast actually on the platform. But Somalia alone has the TikTok impression of Somalia is 1.4 billion, more than 50% of that under the age of 15. You have to use the platforms that the kids are using. And I believe that change can happen in two forms, either strong, bold, visionary, people centric, human rights based value system leadership at the top, or dedicating the next 30 years in educating children and recognizing that it's only been one generation that has been lost in the war in Somalia. Although we will never be able to rebuild a society before the war as it once was, we can create a new shared national identity and leverage technology, leverage social media, leverage podcasts like this, decentralized information, make sure that the online conversations are happening offline, reaching the most vulnerable. And one of the greatest benefits of using tools like Instagram and TikTok to communicate very difficult topics is that you can do it in such a short time span and still send a very strong message that's engaging and that sticks with people. So we've been looking at really how to communicate and share information, especially on trainings that we're doing that we may not be able to share openly, that we may not be able to invite every single young person to, but sharing key lessons and highlights, outcomes of it to really inspire a nation and for them to see that these opportunities exist within their country and that they don't have to migrate or they don't have to leave Africa in pursuit of a dignified life where they can reach their full potential, but that it's available right here.
And you are among a great number of peace leaders highlighting the impact of climate change on peace building. In 2021, you called for greater support for local peace builders and civil society who face the daily reality of climate related security challenges in relation to their work. So, I will be speaking a lot today about the reality on the ground. And now we have climate change to contend with as well. And you're also part of the international expert panel for the Environment of Peace initiative. So, what are those climate related challenges that you face as a peace builder, and what kind of support would you like to see giving in relation to this?
Particularly in Somalia, I'll say that young people are very much aware of what's happening around their community. They take it upon themselves to do beach cleanups, to plant trees, to plan for their future. And they're not being engaged as fast and meaningfully as they can be. We know how long it took us to finally change the narrative of young people in the peace building space as not just being potential perpetrators, but actual assets and powerful agents for peace. Do we now have to wait another 15 to 20 years to recognize that young people in the environmental and climate change space can do more than protest and skip school or things like that? Like, can we fast track from the lessons that we've learned in the past to engage youth in these issues more meaningfully and faster? And those are some of the things that we're working towards in Somalia, and now also in the Great Lakes region and the Lake Chad Basin as well too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ilwad, for speaking to me today. We've been talking about the environment and the realities of peace building, the trauma that experienced by you and many other peace builders personally and in the environment, and how you'd like to see resolutions and mechanisms adapted to the new realities using the wealth and years of experiences available locally, and also in better connecting with the youth and making sure that we have those real changes locally. So, to finish our conversation today, if there was one action that you'd like our listeners to take today as a result of listening to this episode, what would that be?
The one action I would encourage our listeners to take away from this is that it's a very grim world that we're living in right now. And there's a lot of challenges. And even in this conversation, I've outlined a lot of those challenges, but to not lose hope, and that there's so much that the average person can do, that there's so many actions that you as an individual can take without being a part of an organized association or being a government official or being, in an serving in an official capacity, but just as a human that's concerned about the trajectory of both our environment and our state of peace globally, that now more than ever, to have hope that you can be activated and you can inform yourself and take steps every single day without waiting for others to tell you or to guide you or to show you how to build peace. Everyone has a role to play. And I hope that even amidst the challenges that we face, that you have to be hopeful, and even more so, you have to act, because everyone has a role to play.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ilwad Elman. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for listening to She Stands for Peace, the podcast series where thought leaders and peace builders share their reflections and best practices in the women, peace and security agenda in Africa. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Don't forget to join the conversation using the hashtag She Stands for Peace.